Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Vanakkam, Namaskar, Jai Hind. Again, we are meeting now in another episode where we shall see some of the unsung heroes of our independence movement. Friends, we all know we are celebrating the Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav, and we are looking at people who have given us this Amrit, this nectar by which we would be surviving and we would be celebrating the progress of our nation. When we look at these people, there is something that we need to realize. Some of their contributions have been for a long period. Some of them just did one act of courageous contribution and disappeared from the scene. So it is not that everybody was in the freedom movement for the same duration. Some of them were young. Some of them started as a youngster and continued in the movement for long. So there are differences, there are variations, but all their contributions have been responsible for us to acquire independence. When I say they were in the movement for a short period, it does not mean that they left the movement. In a way they did. How did they leave the movement? They died. They gave their lives for the sake of the national movement. So, we need to understand the entire picture in the proper way. And some of them were a little revolutionary too. Not everyone was sattvic, because some of them felt that we could get independence only by force and aggression. They were so much pained by the British atrocities that they thought they have to retaliate with aggression. We should not mistake that kind of an activity, not think and look from our ahimsa eyes today. Today we are in a free nation and can talk anything. But those days, when the national movement was at its peak, there were some youngsters who thought only aggression could be the savior. Today, we shall see some of these unsung heroes. The first hero whom we shall look at today is Gopalkrishna Gokhale. Many of us have heard this name, and many of us also know that Gopalkrishna Gokhale was the political mentor of Mahatma Gandhi. Gokhale was born on the 9th of May 1866. He was also called Govind Kishan Gokhale. In fact, his house name was Govind Kishan. Krishna sometimes is called Kishan, right? So, people at home, the members of the family, called him Govind Kishan, while his official name, his name in the records of school and elsewhere, became Gopalkrishna. Generally, when you study history of India, Gopalkrishna Gokhale is classified as that moderate leader. What do we mean by saying he was a moderate leader? This definition we shall see shortly. But now going back to the early life of Gopalkrishna Gokhale, he was born in Maharashtra. His family was very poor, but then his parents thought he should get proper education to sustain himself. And remember, those were days of British colonial power, and unless someone had English education, it was generally felt he or she could not survive well. So Gokhale was also given English education. He studied many things and he became a teacher, a school teacher, and then a college teacher. It so happened that he prized education so much that he wanted all his students to learn well. He would teach them everything. He would tell them everything that he knew and impart education in such a way that the student would grow up to a wholesome individual. This kind of a character invited criticism from his colleagues and people around. Some of his colleagues thought it is sufficient to give that little knowledge to the student that the student deserved, and the rest of it need not be given. That made their jobs easier. So they would be partial, they would only give a little to the student. And Gokhale was against this kind of an attitude. He thought the student deserved everything and would impart all that he had in him, including human values. And he would repeatedly teach the same thing. Now, to slightly deviate, many times, many of us feel that we are not able to retain something that we study. And we keep trying for various solutions. We ask people, what is the best way to remember everything? And if someone scores high in the school or the college, we tend to go and ask them, how did you remember everything? Please tell me the tip. And is there any medicine to improve the memory power? Now, scientifically, if you analyze, the only medicine that can improve the memory power of any individual is commitment to memory again and again. If you keep reading the same thing, if you keep thinking about it, not necessarily only reading, you read something and then keep thinking about it, keep it inside your mind and keep churning it inside, it gets stuck to your memory and remains inside for a longer time or permanently. Now Gokhale knew this, and he would repeat the same chapter, the same information to his students again and again. He never got fed up teaching, and that is why people around him sometimes called him a parrot. They said, you're a parrot, you're repeating like a parrot, you're repeatedly saying the same thing. But he believed in repeatedly imparting that knowledge to the students, and he was a successful teacher in that he nurtured many people. Many of his disciples became great men and women. However, his parents thought that he would have to seek a kind of an official job in one of the British run offices, and Gokhale himself was not very comfortable with that kind of a job. Though Sometimes he did go for such opportunities. He preferred to be a teacher, and it was when that he was working as a teacher, he came in contact with other people who had nationalistic ideas. And then he became part of what is called the Deccan Educational Society. Maharashtra and downwards, the southern part of the country, if you notice, it's a plateau. We call it the Deccan Plateau, isn't it? Dakshina Pithabhumi. So this Deccan Plateau area, people, like-minded people who thought education would be the savior for the upliftment of Indian people, they started what is called the Deccan Educational Society. And it is in this Deccan Educational Society that Gopalkrishna Gokhale came in contact with Bal Gangadhar Tilak. He also came in contact with Mahadev Ranade. Ranade was a great man. We shall see what Ranade contributed in another session. Today, remember, Ranade was a great man and lived up to greater ideals. In fact, he took Gokhale into his fold. Gokhale was so very much influenced by Ranade that Ranade himself called him his Manasaputra of Ranade. Under the stewardship of Ranade, he learnt several things. That was when the nationalistic feeling went into his mind. Of course, as part of his study, as part of his education, he also learnt Western philosophy. Because of his English education, he got to learn English literature, he learnt Western philosophy, and he became an admirer of Edmund Burke. He could quote Edmund Burke very freely. In the Deccan Educational Society, he was sharing his ideas with Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and it was at this time that the Indian National Congress was formed. 4 years from the establishment of the Indian National Congress, Gokhale joined the Congress. And remember, Gokhale was a trendsetter. Today, in 2022, when we celebrate 75 years of the country's independence, we may not even be able to imagine that there could have been a time when the land was ruled by people who did not belong to this soil or this land. When the British colonial rule was existent, it was only the Britishers and the Europeans who were ruling the nation. They were formulating the rules and regulations. They were occupying all positions in the British-run offices. So it was Gokhale who first mooted the idea that Indians should be given appropriate representation in the offices. He demanded that Indians be appointed to the positions of the deputy collector or even the collector. The collector was usually a British person. So Gokhale said, fine, even if the collector was a European, it is possible that the other positions can be occupied by Indians so that Indians participated in the policy making for the country and were taken on the road of self-rule. In 1892 itself, he asked for Indians to be appointed. Just imagine how early it was and what kind of a visionary thinking. Gokhale was a very soft person, but then his ideals were visionary. He thought not for the 5 years or 10 years, but then he thought for 50 years, 100 years, for at least 20-25 generations. And today, if we say Indians have occupied higher positions and higher designations, we will have to remember that the initial change point came because of Gopalkrishna Gokhale. And we should also remember that Gopalkrishna Gokhale, amidst all odds, was standing firm on these ideals. Right from the beginning, he had all difficulties. He was from a very poor family. He had to get educated. He studied English, learned Western philosophy, at the same time presented himself a pure Indian. His attire, his expressions, his work were all rooted in the Indian soil. He asked for greater political representation in the rule of the country. He also asked for greater authority over public affairs. And when I told you earlier that he was a moderate, I also told you we shall see the definition of this term moderate in relation to what it meant those days. Gokhale thought we should have a political dialogue with the ruling British. I told you when we started today's discussion that there were some of our heroes who thought aggression will be the way to get independence. But then people like Gokhale were made of different kind of a stuff. Gokhale thought, yes, we require self-rule. We should be made to rule our own selves. At the same time, it is not by agitating or being aggressive, but then let's go and talk to the British people. Let's get into the offices. That was the first step. Let's get into the offices, learn the administration, learn the rule, and prove to them, see, we know how to rule ourselves. So let's get into a kind of a dialogue. Let's achieve what we want by a sattvic and representational method. And this only became the kind of the moderate attitude later on. So he would advocate that we could talk to the British officials. In fact, several times he was the person who represented Indian interests while there were talks with the British officials. I told you he was part of the Deccan Educational Society and therefore a close associate of Bal Gangadhar Tilak. There were certain features which were common to both of them. They studied in the same college, the Elphinstone College. They both were teachers, and initially both of them were mathematics professors in the college. And then both of them were members of the Deccan Educational Society or the DES. But then the difference was Gokhale wanted to achieve self-rule through moderate methods, methods which are not acute, methods which are not aggressive. When someone is doing things in a kind of a sattvic way, we would call them moderate, isn't it? Not being very forceful. And through talks. But then Bal Gangadhar Tilak was a little radical. He said, no point talking to these people. The Britishers have done so much, they were into so many atrocities that it is not possible to talk to them. They would never see the judge or the justice part of it. they would only kind of be against the Indian sentiments. So Tilak felt people will have to be a little radical and aggressive. This was basically the difference between the two of them. Both of them were in the Indian National Congress, and many of us would have read in our history textbooks that there was a Surat Congress in 1907. The Surat Congress was historical in more than one way. The Surat Congress saw a kind of a rift between the group that advocated and practiced moderate methods and the group that advocated aggressive methods. The group that advocated moderate methods came to be called the moderates, and the group that was a little aggressive came to be called the extremists. So the moderates and the extremists in the Indian National Congress. And in the Surat Congress, which happened in 1907, Gokhale wanted Rash Bihari Ghosh to become the president of the Congress. But then Tilak felt otherwise. So because of this, there was some kind of an argument to start with, and then ultimately it turned out like, when people are in a group and there is division, there is differences of opinions, the Congress split. One side was the extremists, the other side was the moderates, and it so happened in fits of anger and fits of aggression and the kind of deep arguments, there were incidences of some kind of violence, some kind of throwing articles at one another and so on. Aurobindo Ghosh was also there. Aurobindo Ghosh records that there was so much of turmoil and turbulence. But it is also recorded, though parting ways with Tilak with regard to the future method, Gokhale did not lose his respect for Tilak. In the same Surat Congress, when all this events of turbulence were happening, there were so many objects being thrown at each other. It so happened that Tilak was standing in one place and some objects were being hurled at Tilak. It was Gokhale who went and stood next to Tilak and protected him from getting injured. That was the kind of mutual respect they had for each other. In fact, when Gokhale died, Tilak wrote a beautiful homage, a very tearful homage article on Gokhale. So friends, we should remember there can be differences of opinions. There can be differences in the way we look at things. After all, the focus and idea was the same. The intention was independence for the country. But then one person thought this could be the path and another person thought that could be the path. There could be differences in thinking, differences of opinions, but then never hatred between the two. This is a lesson that we all should learn from Gokhale and Tilak. They never nurtured hatred against each other. And what happened to Gokhale further? In 1905, a little earlier to the Surat split, he had started the Servants of India Society. And why? He thought, we all know, that Indians should rule their own selves. And to rule their own selves, they have to equip themselves. And he felt we have to serve the nation to be better equipped to rule our own selves. And that was the motto and the purpose of the establishment of the Servants of India Society. And you just see on the screen what he said about the Servants of India Society when it was started. The Servants of India Society will train men prepared to devote their lives to the cause of country in a religious spirit, and will seek to promote by all constitutional means the national interests of the Indian people. When he said in a religious spirit, it does not mean through religion alone, but then in the spirit of being religiously involved. When someone is deeply involved in something, we say he is religiously doing it, he is religiously involved, and that is the kind of involvement that Gokhale aimed at. In fact, with regards to the Congress, though the Congress had split at the Surat Congress, till his last breath, Gokhale would attempt to unite the two different factions. He would request several people to mediate and unite the factions together. Till his last breath, he tried for it. But then he could not succeed. And when he died with that pain that there were two factions in the Indian National Congress. He was, in a way, the political mentor of Mahatma Gandhi. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi himself records this. In 1912, Mahatma Gandhi, who was by then only Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi in South Africa, invited Gopalkrishna Gokhale, knowing about Gopalkrishna Gokhale and his Servants of India Society and his ideals. Gandhi invited him to come over to South Africa. 1912, Gokhale went to South Africa, and it was there that he kind of put the idea into Gandhi's mind that Gandhi will have to come to India and work for India's independence. And we all know Gandhi did come to India, and the rest is history. Gopalkrishna Gokhale also mentored so many other national leaders. We've already seen people like Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, Sarojini Naidu, were all influenced by Gokhale's nationalistic feelings to start with. Gopalkrishna Gokhale was a great leader, a great teacher, a man who strived for this country's independence. Not only himself, but then he also made so many of our men and women become national heroes. In other words, we can say Gopalkrishna Gokhale, the hero who also made other people become heroes. And now you see a photograph in which we find Gokhale. You can identify Gokhale by that turban and the angavastra or the shoulder cloth that is there around his neck. And sitting to the right of Gopalkrishna Gokhale, can you identify the young Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi as he was in South Africa? Gokhale had been honored by the release of a first day car and a postage stamp. As we salute Gopalkrishna Gokhale, we move to the next person from the deep south. Many of you may know that there is a town called Madurai in the state of Tamil Nadu. Madurai, Vaidyanatha Ayer is the unsung hero whom we shall see now. Born in 1890 on the 16th of May, Vaidyanatha Ayer was also a trendsetter. Vaidyanatha Ayer was born in Vishnampetai in the Thanjavur area. Thanjavur is another town of Tamil Nadu on the banks of the river Kaveri. He was the second son in a family that had 8 children, the son of Arunachalam and Lakshmi Ammal. His father happened to be at Madurai when he was young, so Vaidyanatha Ayer was educated at Madurai, at Trichy, and subsequently his collegiate education at Chennai. And those were days of early marriage or child marriage, as we would call today. Vaidyanathan was married when he was 18 years of age to a small little girl called Akilandam, who was just 8 years of age at that point of time. Vaidyanathan was also interested in teaching, so he took up the job of a school teacher. He taught in several schools, including the Masulipatnam school, and it was when he was a teacher he also studied law to become a pleader. These days, when somebody studies law, we say that person graduates to become a lawyer. Is it not? Those days they were called pleaders, and there were different levels. If someone studied law here in India, that was the lower level. They studied law and they became pleaders. In the court, they go and plead for favor to their client. So they were called pleaders. Even today, the same term is being used in several positions which lawyers and people of the law area occupy. Government pleader, we say, isn't it? So, pleader was that level. If someone wants to get higher qualifications, that is when they went to London or Europe to become a barrister. We all know M.K. Gandhi went to London to become a barrister, and several others. Now, Vaidyanathan studied law and became a pleader. Before becoming a pleader, he was a school teacher. But then quite early, as he went into becoming a pleader, he was attracted towards the independence movement. So for his livelihood, he had this profession as a pleader, whatever income that came. But then his active involvement was in the independence movement. He participated in the non-cooperation movement of 1922, and in 1930 the Salt Satyagraha. Salt Satyagraha, when Gandhi made his historic Dandi March in the north, a few months later the same Salt Satyagraha happened as the Vedarathnam March in Tamil Nadu. The elderly leader of Tamil Nadu, Chakravarti Rajagopalacharya, was given the responsibility of leading the Salt Satyagraha of the south, and Rajaji, as Chakravarti Rajagopalacharya is fondly called, led the march from Tiruchirappalli to Vedarathnam. About Vedarathnam we shall shortly see. But for the present, let us know Madurai Vaidyanatha Ayer was part of this march from Trichy to Vedarathnam to get salt from the salt fields at Vedarathnam. It was a movement against the salt tax levied by the British, and Madurai Vaidyanatha Ayer was an active participant in the Salt Satyagraha of 1930. Of course, subsequently, he was also part of the Quit India movement. When we see 1922, 1930, 1942, it does not mean that there were gaps in between. We are only trying to highlight the important landmarks. But then his participation in the movement was continuous. He was a khadi advocate. He would only wear khadi. And he was part of that movement that boycotted foreign goods. It was also at the same time, as he participated in the independence movement, he felt social reforms were necessary. We've already seen social reforms will lead to early acquisition of independence, is what even Mahatma Gandhi thought. Mahatma Gandhi made the independence movement a kind of a social movement with participation from the common man. And Madurai Vaidyanatha Ayer, who was a Gandhian at large, also professed these ideals. So, he became part of what was called the Tamil Nadu Harijana Seva Sangam, the Tamil Nadu Harijan Welfare Society, Harijana Seva. He became the president of the Tamil Nadu Harijana Seva Sangam. Sometime in 1938-39, the British promulgated an act called the Temple Entry Authorization and Indemnity Act. By this act, Dalits and Harijans were prevented from entering the temple. Remember, this was an act which was promulgated by the British people. So, against this act, Vaidyanatha Ayer rose up. On the 8th of July 1939, he decided he would take his Harijan friends into the temple as against the act and as a protest. We should remember that people like Vaidyanatha Ayer did not discriminate Dalits, Harijans from the rest. It was not their idea to discriminate. But when an act was promulgated to protest against it, this was the way he found. So, he entered the Meenakshi Amman temple in Madurai. Many of us know that there is a huge Meenakshi Amman temple, the temple of Lord Shiva and Goddess Meenakshi. Lord Shiva here is called Lord Chokkesa or Lord Sundareswara, and the goddess is Goddess Meenakshi. It's a big temple, a temple which has several exhibits of our ancient arts and culture, a temple which houses wonderful sculptures, and a temple of paramount historical importance. It is into this temple that Vaidyanatha Ayer decided to take his colleagues along. So, on that day, he made the temple entry with P. Kakkan, who rose up to become a minister later on in Tamil Nadu, Muruganandam, Purnalingam, Chinnaya, Muttu, and Gopal Swami. Several of these being Dalits, he took them along and made the historic temple entry. So today, even if you utter the name of Madurai Vaidyanatha Ayer, it is related to the temple entry. Now this may appear to us today as a small little contribution only, one incidence of importance. But then this incidence of importance has so much of significance because That was a landmark in social reform. It was an incident to say that all of us are same and all of us belong to this land and we shall contribute to the goodness of this land. Common we are brethren, we are from the same mother Bharat Mata, and we are all children of Bharat Mata working consciously, unconsciously, subconsciously towards the good of our country. Here you find a stamp, a postage stamp, which had been released in honor of Madurai A. Vaidyanatha Ayer. Friends, we've been talking about the Vedarathnam march, the salt march from Trichy to Vedarathnam, isn't it? So, some of you may be curious to know where this Vedarathnam is and what is this Vedarathnam. Come, let's meet a person, a personality from Vedarathnam, and he is Sardar Vedarathnam Pillai. Sardar Vedarathnam Pillai was born on the 25th of February 1897. You may be curious again to know how this title Sardar came to be associated with Vedarathnam Pillai. Vedarathnam Pillai was born in Vedarathnam. Vedarathnam. Aranyam is forest. It is thought that this particular place, which is on the seashore, was guarded by the four Vedas. The four Vedas became a kind of a forest, and it is in this forest, in the Vedarathnam, that the God manifested himself as Vedarathnam. He is the Ratnam, he is the jewel of the Vedas. So, children born in this area or children born in this town, it is customary for these children to be named after the god, and many of them were Vedaratnams or Vedappan and so on. This little town gained prominence during the Bhakti movement and subsequently during the national movement also. Vedarathnam was born in a kind of a middle class family at Vedarathnam. Since Vedarathnam is a place on the seashore, salt making was the major trade, and Vedarathnam's father himself owned a few salt fields, and Vedarathnam also came to have, he inherited the property and he was the owner of some salt fields. When the salt satyagraha was announced by Mahatma Gandhi, the same salt satyagraha will have to be reenacted in different parts of the country. And it was when Gandhi assigned the responsibility of conducting the salt satyagraha in Tamil Nadu to Chakravarti Rajagopalacharya. And what was to be done? What exactly was the salt satyagraha? The British had levied tax on salt. So when people had to buy salt, they had to pay tax. But then where did this salt come from? It was the salt which was made from the salt fields of our own country and then taken to the shop by the British and resold to us with a tax. And salt is something that everybody needed. So Gandhi, in his protest against the British way, not our own people, but then protesting against the British ways, called for the salt satyagraha. During this salt satyagraha, people would go to the place where the salt fields were, and in the salt fields, what happened? The seawater was stored, was kind of made stagnant in specially created areas, right? There were pits, simply putting it, there were pits, and the seawater was stored in those pits, and over the course of time, because of evaporation, only the salt got left out. That was the residue. The water became vapor. Water vapor, the rain cycle and all that, water evaporated and the salt was left out as residue. So this salt they picked. They picked the salt and started selling it. That was the salt satyagraha movement. As a protest, they picked that salt and started selling the salt and said this is free of cost and so on. So when Chakravarti Rajagopalacharya was to conduct the salt satyagraha in Tamil Nadu, he thought of Vedaratnam Pillai because he knew Vedaratnam Pillai would cooperate the utmost. So he thought of Vedaratnam Pillai, and Vedaratnam Pillai was in Vedaranyam, a sea-coast town, and also possessed some salt fields in his possession, in his ownership. So from Trichy, they marched to Vedaranyam, and Sardar Vedaratnam Pillai was waiting. By then he was not Sardar, he was only Vedaratnam Pillai. He was waiting for this entire battalion to come from Trichy. So many of them, hundreds and hundreds of salt satyagraha soldiers or hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. He received all of them, he gave them food, he gave them places of stay, and then permitted salt satyagraha to happen in a salt field. He also led the march, groups and groups of people. So every group, each group was led by one person. He also led the march. Now what happened after that? Natural. The leaders were arrested, the protesters were arrested, put in jail. That was natural, right? That is the reaction that we would expect. The British arrested these people. Now comes the comparison. When it is somebody else, that somebody else got arrested, was imprisoned for some time, and then of course left out, right? That is the price for participating in the salt satyagraha. But then for Vedaratnam Pillai, he got arrested, he was imprisoned, he was in jail, put in jail, but also it was his salt field, the property of the salt field was confiscated. Why? Even the other properties of his were confiscated. His properties were all confiscated and taken by the British. They were not returned. So he lost his properties too. Isn't it a kind of a double sacrifice or a multiple sacrifice? But he did not bother about it. He did not bother about losing his property. He was part of the salt satyagraha. His father was called Appukutti Pillai and his mother was Thangamachi. Of course, his first plunge was into the non-cooperation movement in the 1920s, boycott of foreign goods. We should know something about this. The British were trying to sell our own things to us, like the salt. So what they did, they took cotton from here, took that cotton, made us grow cotton, took that cotton from here, shipped it, made textiles and brought the textile and sold it to us. And that is why boycott of foreign cloth became a big movement. Why should that cloth come to us? We will spin our own textile and clothing. That is when Gandhi started the Charkha movement, spinning of khadi, wearing only khadi. homespun, locally spun clothing and not getting the yarn from there, getting the textile from there. So boycott of foreign clothing, and ultimately it got expanded, it became boycott of foreign goods also, because the British were trying to manufacture goods and bring it back to us. So he was part of the boycott of foreign goods movement, and then in 1930, of course, he took part in the salt satyagraha. Subsequent to the salt satyagraha in 1931, there was a meeting in Tirunelveli, a huge meeting, a huge gathering to honor Vedarathnam Pillai. It was a meeting of like-minded people so that awareness about the independence movement could be increased. You should understand, those days people went on, leaders went on from town to town and spread the awareness and called for people to participate in the national movement. In one such meeting at Tirunelveli, the people who had gathered there called Vedarathnam Pillai Sardar. We all know Vallabhbhai Patel was called Sardar. Sardar because of his iron mind, because of his firm vairagya. And Vedarathnam Pillai also had the same vairagya. Losing everything, he did not bother. He wanted to be part of the movement. In 1944, Kasturba Gandhi died. After Kasturba's death, Vedarathnam Pillai thought, that made a change in his mind. He was so much loyal to Gandhi and Kasturba. So he thought he should do something for the protection and welfare of women and children. He instituted a trust, a kind of a trust where funds can be put in and can be spent for the welfare of women and children. The Kasturba Kanya Gurukulam was started by him at Vedarathnam, and till today the Kasturba Kanya Gurukulam is functioning. He was made a member of the Legislative Council later on, but then even that salary, whatever salary he got, he gave it to the Ramakrishna mission. Such was the contribution, such was the sacrifice of this simple looking man from Vedarathnam, Sardar Vedarathnam Pillai. And friends, what do we learn from all these people? It is not that we recollect their contribution because it's Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav, just 1 year to celebrate and then forget. No. If it's Amrit, it gives us life. We should remember these people have given us life. And we should also remember how well can we fix their ideals into our life circumstances today. We can think of Gokhale and his love to everyone, his way of making everyone collectively do things for the country, for the society. It is collective intelligence and collective responsibility, and work for the country. We can think of Madurai Vaidyanatha Ayer and be compassionate to everyone. There is no discrimination amongst all these children. Amongst all these children, there is no discrimination. So it is that lesson that we learn from Vaidyanatha Ayer and from Vedarathnam Pillai. Come what may, if you take up an ideal, even today there can be problems when we take up an ideal, when we want to achieve something in our everyday life. But come what may, whatever difficulties, whatever is the loss, stick to that ideal. Try to achieve, keep that focus in mind and achieve. Whatever is the situation, whatever that needs to be sacrificed, money, power, authority, wealth, all that can be sacrificed, but then the focus should be important. And that is what Sardar Vedarathnam Pillai has given us. And we close today's session, we shall meet again with more heroes. Namaste and Vanakkam.